My Uncle Cecil was the kind of man people crossed the street to avoid. Not because he was dangerous, at least, that's what I used to think. He just made people uncomfortable in a way that was hard to explain. He lived alone on 40 acres of spruce and muskeg outside of Kenora, Ontario, drove a rusted-out '94 F-150 that he refused to replace, and hadn't attended a single family gathering in over a decade. My mother called him difficult. My grandfather, before he passed, just shook his head whenever Cecil's name came up, the way you'd shake your head at weather you couldn't do anything about. I hadn't seen my uncle in 11 years when the call came. It was a Tuesday in late February, that gray, defeated stretch of winter where you stop believing spring is real. I was sitting in my apartment in Thunder Bay, eating leftover pho and staring at a stack of unopened mail that I kept telling myself I'd deal with. I was 29, working part-time at a building supply warehouse while I figured out what I actually wanted to do with my life. That's what I told people. I'm figuring it out. What I meant was, I'm avoiding everything. The lawyer's name was Harrington. He spoke in the careful, measured cadence of someone who delivers difficult news for a living. Cecil had died 3 weeks earlier. A neighbor, another bush dweller about 6 kilometers down the logging road, had noticed the truck hadn't moved in a while and called it in. The coroner said it was his heart. 61 years old. Apparently, he'd been alone when it happened, which, knowing my uncle, was probably exactly how he would have wanted it. I was the only living relative who hadn't explicitly told the estate lawyers to take whatever was left and donate it to charity. There isn't much of an estate, Harrington said carefully. The property itself, some equipment, the contents of the cabin. What about debt? I asked. Because that was the first thing that occurred to me. My uncle had never struck me as someone with a strong financial plan. There was a pause. No outstanding debt, actually. The property taxes are current. He owned the land free and clear. That surprised me. Everything about Cecil surprised me, it turned out, once I started paying attention. I drove up to Kenora on a Thursday, my Subaru packed with a sleeping bag and 3 days' worth of groceries because Harrington had warned me the cabin was remote and had no reliable internet. The Trans-Canada was clear, but the temperature was sitting at -23, and by the time I turned off onto the logging road that led to Cecil's property, the sky had gone the color of old pewter, and the trees were closing in on both sides like walls. I'd been to the property once as a kid, maybe 8 or 9 years old. A brief visit with my grandfather that I barely remembered. What I did remember was the feeling of the place, how still it was, how the silence wasn't empty, but full, like the forest was listening. The cabin itself was smaller than I'd built it up to be in my memory. A single-story structure of squared timber, a wood stove chimney, 2 small windows at the front. There was a generator shed off to the side and a woodpile that stretched nearly 20 meters along the south wall. Enough wood to last 2 winters, stacked with meticulous precision. Whatever else my uncle had been, he was not a careless man. Harrington had couriered me a key. I let myself in. The inside smelled like wood smoke and something herbal, cedar, maybe, or spruce tips. It was cold. The wood stove had been out for weeks. There was a single iron bed with a wool blanket folded at the foot, a kitchen table with 2 chairs, a small bookshelf crammed with field guides and government survey maps, and a few paperbacks with their spines so broken I couldn't read the titles. On the wall above the table, pinned without frames, were several topographic maps of the Kenora district, covered in handwritten annotations in a small, precise script. I stood there for a long moment, just looking. I had expected. I don't know what I had expected. Squalor, maybe, the accumulation of a man who had given up. But the cabin was clean, orderly. There were dishes stacked neatly by the small propane sink. A pair of work boots lined up precisely at the door. The wood stove, when I opened it to start a fire, had been cleaned out recently, the ash pan emptied, the grate brushed. Someone had been taking care of this place with real intention, and I got a fire going and sat down at the table with a cup of instant coffee. He had a full tin of it, red rose, which made me think of my grandfather, and started going through the papers that Harrington had told me were in the kitchen drawer. They were methodical. receipts for the property taxes going back 30 years, a maintenance log for the generator, some correspondence with the municipality about a survey dispute, and at the very bottom of the stack, a single sealed envelope with my name on it, not the legal name on my birth certificate, just Theo. My hands were steadier than I expected when I opened it. If you're reading this, my uncle had written, in that same small, precise script I'd seen on the maps, then I ran out of time before I could explain things in person. I'm sorry for that. I should have tried harder. There are some things about this property you need to understand before you make any decisions about it. Don't sell to anyone who comes to you directly. Don't sign anything until you've looked at what's in the floor of the workshop. I hope you're doing all right, Theo. I always thought you had more sense than you were given credit for. There was no signature. Just that. The workshop was the low structure behind the main cabin that I'd taken for a storage shed. It had a padlock on it, same key as the cabin, it turned out. Inside, a serious woodworking bench, a table saw, a band saw, a rack of hand tools arranged with the same precision as everything else. The smell of sawdust and machine oil. A workbench lamp casting a cold white circle of light. I stood in the middle of the floor and looked down. The planking was rough-cut spruce, old and darkened with age. But in the far corner, near the base of the bench, there was a section that was slightly different. The color a shade lighter, the fit of the boards just marginally tighter than the rest of the floor. You'd miss it if you weren't looking. I almost did. I found the edge with a pry bar from the tool rack. The section lifted in one piece, like a hatch, hinged on the underside. Below it was a steel box set into a concrete form in the earth, roughly the size of a large trunk, with a combination lock on the hasp. I sat back on my heels and looked at it for a long time. The letter hadn't given me a combination. I went back to the cabin and read it 3 more times, looking for something I'd missed. Then I started going through the survey maps on the wall, looking at the annotations more carefully. They were coordinates, mostly, grid references, survey markers, elevation notes. But in the corner of one map, the one covering the section of land directly around the cabin, there was a small cluster of numbers that didn't correspond to anything geographic. I tried them as a 6-digit combination. The lock opened on the first attempt. Inside the box were 3 things. A smaller fireproof document case, a canvas satchel, heavy, the kind you'd use for camera equipment, and a notebook. Not a journal, not a diary, but a systematic record of something, dense with dates and amounts and names. I opened the document case first. Inside were the original title deeds to the property, some personal papers, my uncle's birth certificate, a few photographs I'd never seen, and a thick folder of correspondence. The correspondence was between my uncle and a federal fisheries officer named Okafor, spanning almost 8 years. I picked up the notebook. It took me about 40 minutes to understand what I was reading. When I did, I set it down on the workbench and sat very still for a while, listening to the wind in the spruce trees outside. My uncle Cecil. The difficult one, the one people crossed the street to avoid, the one my mother called embarrassing at family dinners, had spent the better part of 12 years quietly documenting a systematic illegal dumping operation that had been contaminating the English river system north of Kenora. The operation involved 2 companies, one a mining services contractor out of Sudbury, one a smaller outfit, registered in Thunder Bay that appeared, from the notebook, to exist primarily to receive and conceal payments. Over the course of 12 years, my uncle had recorded dates, GPS coordinates, photographs. The canvas satchel contained a compact waterproof camera and 4 micro SD cards in a plastic case, and a meticulous accounting of what had been dumped, where, and when. He had cross-referenced the dumping sites with fish kill reports going back 2011. He had documented 3 separate occasions when he'd attempted to file formal complaints with the Provincial Environment Ministry and received no response. He had then found Okafor. The correspondence told that story in pieces. Okafor had been cautious at first. The early letters were careful, almost bureaucratic. But over time, as my uncle kept sending evidence, the tone shifted. The last letter from Okafor, dated 14 months before Cecil's death, said, "We're close. Don't do anything that draws attention. Keep the materials secure. I opened the canvas satchel and looked at the camera. The battery was dead, but the SD cards were labeled in my uncle's handwriting with dates and locations. I had no way to view them right then. I sat down on the workshop floor. The concrete was freezing cold through my jeans and I didn't care, and I thought about my uncle driving his rusted F-150 down logging roads in the dark to photograph illegal waste disposal. I thought about him writing letters to a fisheries officer in Ottawa with the patient, stubborn persistence of someone who had decided this was simply the thing they were going to do. I thought about my family calling him difficult. I thought about what the word difficult actually means. When you apply it to someone who refuses to look away from something that everyone else has decided is easier to ignore. That night I couldn't sleep. I lay in my uncle's iron bed under his wool blanket and stared at the ceiling and listened to the spruce trees moving in the wind outside. At some point around 2 in the morning, I got up, put on my coat, and went back to the workshop. I took the notebook and the document case and the camera satchel, and I put them in the back of my Subaru, under the sleeping bag, and I sat in the driver's seat in the dark for a long time. There had been a number in the correspondence, Okafor's direct line, handwritten in the margin of one of the later letters. I found it again and saved it in my phone. In the morning, I called him. He picked up on the second ring, which surprised me. I said I was Cecil's nephew, and there was a silence that lasted maybe 5 seconds, and then he said, "I've been wondering if anyone would call." He told me that the investigation had been ongoing, but that without my uncle actively providing updates, they had lost momentum. The evidence my uncle had gathered was strong, he said, but it needed to be formally submitted through the right channels to be admissible. He asked me where the materials were. I told him they were in my car. Another silence. Then, "Don't go back to the cabin alone. I want to send someone up there." "Why?" "Because," Okafor said carefully, "the people your uncle was documenting are aware that he's passed, and they may be interested in what he left behind." I looked out the windshield at the spruce trees and the flat gray February sky. "How interested?" I asked. "Interested enough that you should stay somewhere other than the property tonight." I thought about the notebook, the names in it, the amounts. The careful 12-year-long record of something that a lot of people had a strong financial interest in making disappear. Okay, I said. What do I do? What followed was not dramatic in the way that dramas are dramatic. There were no car chases. No one broke into the cabin, though Okafor later told me that the logging road had shown vehicle traffic in the week after my uncle's death. Someone had been out there, looking. The two companies named in the notebook had, apparently, already retained legal counsel and were in the early stages of a strategy to dispute the ownership and chain of custody of any materials found on the property, should they surface publicly. What there was instead, 3 days in a motel in Kenora, waiting. A federal courier who arrived on the second day and took formal custody of the materials. A long phone call with a federal crown attorney whose name I've agreed not to use publicly. A stack of papers that I signed in a Tim Hortons on the edge of town while a paralegal watched over my shoulder. And a question that I turned over and over during those 3 days, the way you turn something over in your hands to understand its shape. The property was mine. The land was worth something. Not a fortune, but something. There had been a developer who'd already made contact through Harrington, interested in the timber rights. I could sell, pay off my student loans, start fresh somewhere. Nobody would blame me. My uncle had kept his secret for 12 years without telling a single person in his family. Whatever happened next was not technically my responsibility. I kept coming back to the notebook. The fish kill records, the coordinates of dump sites on a river system that people fished, that people drank from, that had been quietly poisoned for over a decade, while the right complaints were filed with the wrong ministries, and the right people looked the other way. My uncle had not looked the other way. I thought about what it cost him. Not money. The land was paid for, the taxes were current, he'd clearly managed. What it cost him in the other currency, the one you spend in isolation, in the small hours, in the accumulated weight of carrying something alone for a very long time. He had never married, never seemed close to it, from what little I knew. He had stopped coming to family events somewhere around the time the correspondence with Okafor began, which I now suspected was not coincidence. You can't carry something like that and also sit at a Christmas dinner table making small talk about hockey. On the third day, I called Harrington and told him I was keeping the property. He was professionally neutral about this, which I appreciated. I also told him that if the developer made contact again, to let them know the property was not available and would not be available. I don't know exactly what I'm going to do with 40 acres of spruce and muskeg in northwestern Ontario. I've driven back out there twice since February, once in April when the snow was finally starting to pull back from the south-facing slopes, once in June when the spruce were putting out new growth, that bright acid green that only lasts about 2 weeks before it deepens. Both times I walked the property boundary, following the survey markers that my uncle had annotated on his maps. I found 2 of the trail cameras he'd used for his documentation, still mounted in the trees, weathered, batteries long dead. The investigation is still ongoing. Okafor calls me occasionally with updates, which I'm not at liberty to discuss in detail. What I can say is that the 2 companies are no longer operating under their original registrations, and that there are proceedings underway that Okafor describes as moving in the right direction. In the tone of someone who has learned not to make predictions, the cabin is solid. Better than I thought once I had someone look at it properly. The wood stove needs a new flue collar, but the structure itself is sound. My uncle built well, or had it built well, and had maintained it the same way he maintained everything, with the kind of patient, unflashy attention that doesn't look like much until you see what it's protected over 30 years. I've started going through his field guides. He made annotations in those too, pencil, small and precise, mostly observations about birds and plant phenology, the kind of notes a serious amateur naturalist makes over decades of paying close attention to one piece of land. There's a passage in his copy of Godfrey's Birds of Canada where he's circled the range map for the common loon and written in the margin, "Still here." I don't know exactly what he meant by that. But I think about it. My mother asked me recently what I was planning to do. Not just about the property, about everything. My job, my apartment in Thunder Bay, my life in general. She has a particular tone she uses when she asks this, not unkind, but tinged with the specific anxiety of someone who loves you and is not sure you're going to be okay. I told her I was figuring it out. What I meant, this time, was something different. My uncle Cecil spent 12 years paying attention to something that no one else wanted to look at, on a piece of land that no one else thought was worth much, alone in a way that his family mistook for being difficult. He kept records with a patience that I find, the more I understand it, almost incomprehensible. He trusted that eventually the right person would open the right drawer and read the right letter and make the right call. He turned out to be right. I don't know if the river gets better. I don't know how long it takes for a system to recover from that kind of damage or whether it fully does. Okafor is cautiously optimistic. I've started reading about it. Remediation science, environmental damages fund claims, the legal framework for contaminated site liability under the Canadian Environmental Protection Act. This is not something I expected to become interested in. But my uncle apparently had a lot of the same material on his bookshelf, and I've been working through it in the evenings, in the cabin, with the wood stove going and the sound of the wind in the spruce trees outside. There's something I want to say to whoever might be listening to this, not about environmental law or federal investigations, or the particular stubbornness required to document something alone for 12 years on a hunch that someone, eventually, would care. Just this, the people your family calls difficult, the ones who go quiet at dinners, who live in ways nobody quite understands, who seem to have stepped sideways out of the life everyone expected them to lead. Sometimes they're carrying something. Sometimes the distance isn't indifference. Sometimes it's the opposite. My uncle Cecil never told me he cared about me. He never told anyone in our family much of anything, as far as I can tell. But he addressed that envelope with my name on it, and he trusted me with the only thing that had mattered to him for 12 years. I think that might be the most anyone's ever trusted me with anything. The loons are back on the lake at the north end of the property. I saw them last week from the shoreline, a pair, moving together through the dark water, absolutely unbothered. My uncle wrote about them in his field notes. He'd been tracking the same pair, or possibly their descendants, for 9 consecutive summers. Still here. I'm going to try to keep it that way.